Greetings, friends. Here we are again. I've got some viewers on already. Almost as if you're actually waiting for this. Thanks. Thanks for coming on and waiting for this. So, start off with our usual. From the Tomes. Twitch TV, From the Tomes. Obviously, if you're watching this live, you already know where it's at. If you are not watching it live, if you watch this on YouTube and you want to get in on these periodic chats, though I guess they could be periodicals, then head on over to Twitch and subscribe there. And From the Tomes is also available on YouTube at foxandboardgames.com and all major social media. You can find me at foxandboardgames.com, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Who is hello, how's it going? Good to see you. Mr. Bear. So, thanks everyone for watching, tuning in, liking, subscribing, supporting. There's Wolfie. Hey. No, that's all's good, Wolfie. Actually, I was gonna drop you a note if I didn't see you this week, so I was like, I haven't seen him on in a while. There's Jay. What's going on? Throwing some dice at me in memory of our Sunday Blood Bowl match, in which the last two turns had nothing but skulls come up whenever anyone tried to do anything, which was pure hilarity. Yeah, so most of all, of course, you should know foxandboardgames.com is where you find everything. In fact, I have something up there right now for those of you who have not already seen it. If you go and you subscribe to the mailing list, you get a little document that I wrote, a free download, a PDF, about 5 pages of some just tips and tricks that I've been using in story design for, well, quite a long time. But the crux of it is that it's all stuff that's useful. There's Peach. What's going on? Hot takes. We've got some hot takes. I don't know if tonight's going to be that hot. Tonight's not going to be as hot as the OGL drama. That was like 3 weeks worth of great material I didn't even have to work for. I didn't have to research. I just had to sit back and go, let's see them light themselves on fire now. How are they gonna stick a knife in their own foot now? So we'll see how that all plays long term. But yeah, a couple big pieces of news. Let's see. Oh, I can't forget to mention the Patreon, which I guess I should. I thought I had that on here. No, do I see it? No. Oh, here it is. Patreon.com. First thing, Fox and Board Games. I had to do some juggling of some files, and I actually lost a couple of these files, or should I say misplaced them, and I had to redo it. Oh, there were people who literally on YouTube were making bank off OGL. And a lot of it was BS. Like I've said, it was just some guy making stuff up about some secret insider source he has. Some of it was really good, though. I mean, some of it was quite good material, quite good feedback and thoughts. Especially when you had like a real lawyer, like the one that I showed a clip of and I read a little bit out of. You had a real lawyer sitting there and talking about all this, and I'm like, okay, this guy I'm going to listen to because he actually knows a lot. He knows way more than me. And he knows way more than most gamers about how things can play out. So that's worth it. But yeah, head over to the Patreon if you want to get some exclusive content. I've been putting a little bit up there. I've tried to get something up each week that's just for patrons. Today I did the timeline of Asvarna, the world in which Tales of the Harrow Land is set, the kind of prehistoric through modern timeline, which is only, maybe half a page. It's not so fleshed out, that it takes up 30 pages of content. So yeah, Wolfie. So last week I had fully intended that was one of my on weeks to run. So I skipped a week to prep for the con. I did it when I came back from the con. I was gonna do it 2 weeks later, but I actually had a Call of Cthulhu game to run online. A paid Call of Cthulhu game to run. Mother of Monsters had 4 very eager players who wanted it last week, and I said. Yeah, and I said, yeah, sure. So we shifted the chats. In fact, I had a talk with Maeve, who's been doing the social media quite effectively, quite wonderfully. And I said, I think it's important that if someone wants me to run a game, she, of course, agreed. Yeah, definitely. Might as well keep that going. And that's all going to ramp up. So I'll talk to that now. Let's see. Yeah, right. Of course. Why not? Why? Well, it's funny. So that's what they all were like. We see a lot of games being run online for all these systems, and Call of Cthulhu is like the third most popular game out there right now worldwide. It's more popular than Pathfinder in several parts of the world by a stretch. In one or two cases, in one or two Asian countries, it's more popular than D&D. Shockingly, yeah. Well, exactly. The math works out. The math works out. And but two of the players were like, but we can never actually get an online Cthulhu game to run. It's like either like everybody drops or the GM changed it to another night that doesn't work for people. And I said to them, I said, well, not for nothing, but that's one of the things I am kind of priding myself on. That especially if you say I'm going to give you money to run me a game, I'm not gonna throw it at the last minute unless like my power goes out, which, as some of you know, is not very unlikely back here, and it's already happened once before a scheduled game. So things happen that are beyond our control. I have a generator, but if it's an hour to game time, trying to get everything up and running before game time just becomes this mess. So yeah, I figured sure I'll run the Call of Cthulhu game that night. So that's why I didn't do it last week. We actually finished that game Monday night, and that was really fun. That was a cool game. So a couple of updates for those of you who don't follow the social media as intently. Got the LLC status from both Pennsylvania and the federal government. So the company is an official game company now. I guess that means I better produce something, right? So that's kind of cool because I now can actually utilize. Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Well, somebody said to me, one of the players said to me, I was amazed. I got on. You had all the characters all set for us. You had all the maps ready. And I'm like, people are charging you to do this, and they don't do that, I'm like, I do that for my regular fun groups, I'd be shocked. I would never like run a paid game and like be like 20 minutes in like, oh wait, I forgot to upload your characters. Hold on, I know people do it, and I've heard stories already of this being a thing. So, it's nice. It's nice to hear it. It's nice to hear people who are actually very experienced players compliment me on the stories and on the presentation. I don't know if anyone here has tried Foundry VTT, but I'm considering taking a look at it. Maybe not for Call of Cthulhu, but for fantasy games, apparently it's really, really nice, and it's really interactive, and it makes Roll20 look really primitive, but of course it's like 8 years old, newer or something. But yeah, it's cool getting the status of. Oh wow, I just took up that entire screen, which actually isn't a bad thing. It's cool getting the status of LLC. It needed to be done. It needed to be done, especially before we start even thinking about crowdfunding or selling things, because it's even if I make 15,000 on a Kickstarter, which I mean, frankly, I hope it's going to be more to actually produce a game. Maybe not. Not next week. I'm talking down the road. That has to be separate from me. From my personal accounts and from the house and from my assets. It just has to be in case there's any problem. And I already have like an accountant who's willing to consult with me, and I'm going to be doing this as fully prepared as possible. I've learned from watching other people fail, and not fail because they're incapable, but fail because they don't take the necessary legal precautions and financial precautions to make sure they don't end up under the wheels of a problem. So I really decided I was going to do it by the books. Plus, also while I'm on sabbatical, it does separate contractually. It actually does separate my holdings and earnings from anything that happens with the company. So. It was advised that I do this. So let's see. So Tales of the Harrowed Land, as of this morning, I'm gonna say is at 96 to 97% completion of the pre-edit draft. Now, of course, I still have to do a full proofreading. I still have to do full editing, full edit draft. Really, first we're getting. Yes, yeah. VTT Foundry, I'm hearing is is a way to do things. So I will be looking at it, but I had to get this book done first, and it is almost done. I am on the bestiary, the kind of the end point of most of these projects. I mean, I might be still adjusting some content. I might still be saying, uh, yeah, I've heard it's very nice. So yeah, I'll take a look. I'll take a look, especially if I intend to do. I don't know how it interfaces with D and D Beyond. I know the one thing about Roll20 is it interfaces really well with D and D Beyond, and I'd have to take a look. But the book is almost done. I'd say all the actual core content is done. And as far as the bestiary goes, I'm in a weird place. I'm gonna actually talk about this more in a couple of weeks on a chat because I'm gonna do a chat on monsters. But it's not a game about going out and killing monsters as much as it is about a narrative place for these kinds of things. It was okay, so yeah, we'll see. We'll see if it maintains that. But I wanted to have, even if not a lot of monsters, I do have some. I do have some creatures that are native to the world, that are unique to the world. I wasn't gonna make another version of orcs. Like I wasn't. Like no, I'm not doing it. I'm not gonna make a. No, I mean, there are some standard mythical creatures that you would recognize in almost any world mythology. So yes, well, yeah, I know you can do that with Roll20. So okay, knowing that you can do that to Foundry is something that I will make me think about it if I decided to start running D&D online regularly. That's still a big if because there are a lot of people doing it. And I'd almost just rather stick in niche environments. Niche environments. Um, but yeah, once I get this formatted, the creature, it's not only going to be a bestiary, not only monsters, but it's going to be your standard animals, statistics for standard animals, statistics for if you meet your average barbarian in the woods, what would their stats be? That kind of thing. The rogues gallery, the ubiquitous rogues gallery of, the game master needs a town guard. Okay, pull this guy out. He can function as a town guard or whatever. And so I need to get that in order. And then beyond that, it's just going to be some more organization of the resources within the book. I have to make the good map of the world. I'm probably going to be using Incarnate. I have to really make a solid map and it's some regional maps. The scenarios that are going to be included in the books, those still have to be done. They're written up, but they have to be formatted in such a way that someone besides me can actually run them. One of them is Blood Out of Bondages. I could probably hand that to somebody with a little bit of work. The other one is Curses Sicaria is a little bit dicey. And the third still has to be written, but it's very straightforward and short. It's the closest thing to a dungeon crawler you're going to get in the game, and it's just to introduce mechanics. So, yeah, so that's where I'm at with that. So that's the big news of this week. Let's dive into it. Race versus culture. Race. Let's start talking about fantasy races. Boy, again, we discussed this earlier this midway through last year. It was one of the summer topics. It was one of the most well attended and one of the most vocal topics. Where to even begin? Let's first start with what we race versus culture versus background. Well, and background's a totally different thing. I'm not even really getting into background on this case, but I can at least touch on it. But let's even step. Background is slightly different, exactly. Let's even step a little bit outside of this idea of race and culture, and let's just talk about, or should I say, let's step out of this idea of race and culture in RPGs. And let's just look at one of our old friends from Star Trek. Like this is kind of the archetypical idea of what race in a game or in a fantasy world or in a sci-fi world is like. It's like these people who are these monoculture, almost homogenous in thought. It's this very Western colonialist view on the rest of the world. And that's kind of where I came to with all this. And I read a really interesting article. I do have this article. I hope I have it bookmarked because it's a super cool article and it's not very in depth, but it's really interesting talking about the origins of fantasy races, which aren't Tolkien. Because in Tolkien's world, they are totally different. They're not people. They're not other types of people. And that gets into this whole bundle of worms. Precisely. Right. Race. And this is why, and we've recently heard that the 5th edition of D&D, or the 5.5 edition of D&D, will not use the term race. And of course, there are loads of people online going completely batshit over this idea that you can't call them races because now it's politically correct, and you're bowing to the liberal left or whatever if you stop using the word race. I mean, they're not entirely wrong, but they're entirely wrong, because race is a social construct. There is no such thing as race as most people think. So if I remember 5th grade bio, it's King Philip came over from Genoa. Yeah, singing. Yeah, exactly. Singing Rammstein. Yeah. And it's quite literally a social construct to reinforce things like a feudal system or a neo-feudal system in slavery. That's what race is the word race, as we know it today, is entirely about. And if, there might be some viewers who are going to tune into this later and think like, oh, this guy's some hippie liberal. And in this case, it's just purely a rush. In this case, it's just purely factual. That's where this whole idea of race comes from, and reducing the worth of a human being to a certain value based upon their genetic and ethnic makeup. And this is purely history. This is not a liberal hoax or anything like that. So the very use of the term race is in fact racist. It is in fact prejudicial. It is in fact bigoted. And that's something that a lot of people, and I've seen quite a few people online, a few of whom I thought might know better, have a real problem with that concept, that term race itself. And again, I'm not doing this to espouse a political agenda. This is historical. People always say, well, we don't want to erase history, even if it's terrible. Well, this is part of it. Slavery and colonialism is, in fact, tied in with the word race. So the ancestry or heritage, and I think Pathfinder is already using those. I don't really recall. I have to go back and look. But, well, and some people don't like change, right? And they see it as it's being weaponized. I personally don't care if they drop the term race. I've stopped using the term race in casual vernacular. So there's Skullstein. What's going on? PF2, yep, PF2 is using ancestry. So this extends into the fantasy world, because our first concepts of fantasy race and the first use of the terminology apparently actually comes from Robert E. Howard's Conan work. And as we've already discussed, for as much as I may be inspired by the vision of Hyperborea and some of the creations of Robert E. Howard, and Lovecraft and all those guys, their view on the world was from a European colonial perspective. Stygians, the dusky-eyed sorcerers, yes, the dark-skinned and dusky-eyed sorcerers, yes. And this all tied in with the Victorian and post-Victorian fetishism of the Orient, quote unquote. In fact, it's interesting in rereading a little bit of horror on the Orient Express. They actually, I haven't read the newest revisions of it, because I think there has been actually a reprint of it. But the original printing of it, did in fact just totally embrace this whole concept of Orientalism and the Western obsession with Orientalism, and that therefore the name of the Orient Express, this idea of the Orient as exotic. The Orient then being the Near East, the Orient not being far Southeast Asia, the Orient then being Greece, Macedonia, Arabia, modern Middle East. Those were all places that were, the Balkans were all considered the Orient. So it's a really interesting way to jump into it. And, we kind of extend this, like we have the Klingons, and the Klingons are this kind of, hey, I like Klingons, I'm fine with Klingons. But the Orient, yeah, Istanbul. Yeah, Istanbul is where we terminate. That's the old Orient. The Klingons were basically another type of person, generally with darker skin, may or may not have had funny ridges on their head, depending what generation of Trek we're talking about, and all have this same monoculture disposition, much like Westerners assumed and still assume that all people who come from a certain part of the world, let's say Africa, have all the same customs, world outlooks, levels of education, cultural advancement. And again, I am not going to bring up that specter that we have gone over in private circles, that this whole damnation of early fantasy and turn of the century literature, and attempting to make it this crypto eugenics doctrine. Like, there are people who've been leveling this at Tolkien, and that yeah, exactly, not terribly good. Well, but they did introduce this idea of Klingons as being very cultured too, in a very Wagnerian kind of way, in the same way that people in the Victoriana considered the Vikings, and still to this day consider the Vikings as that kind of noble savage, right? Oh, well, but they had all this great poetry and music and culture, even though they went around, pillaging the countryside for gold, slaves and farm animals, pretty much in that order. So it's kind of like, it's that kind of, right. Romulans, cunning, conniving, strategic, inscrutable. You can't tell their emotions. Now, again, Roddenberry was like the anti-Howard in terms of intentional ethnic stereotyping. We all know Roddenberry is not a racist by any stretch of the imagination. Ferengi and gold, right? Now, the only turnaround on that is the cultural identity of most of the actors who played. Yeah, Gene was an uber leftist, and most of the actors who played the Ferengi knew that they were playing the stereotype, and they just pushed it. I would say, unlike George Lucas's Watto, that I still cringe at, because I'm just like this is right off of a World War II propaganda poster, Again, this kind of, in Star Wars, really takes this idea of race as homogenous pigeonholing of a being, of an entity, of an identity. Oh yeah, Armin Shimmerman knew exactly what he was doing. He completely knew what he was doing, and he made no bones about it that he was playing up this stereotype, and he was making fun of this stereotype and pushing it to a limit, including the whole lecherousness. I mean, these things that Semitic people have been accused of now for literally thousands of years. In fact, in Mother of Monsters, there's a sequence that features interactions with gypsies, and the one guy playing is Jewish, and he's like, "Wow, these people are talking about gypsies like people talk about Jews." I'm like, it's all the same. It's all the same propaganda that comes from the Holy Roman Empire and adjacent European cultures being leveled on the other. And I told everybody up front that my portrayal of the attitudes towards gypsies by the local Hungarians is not my attitude towards Romany. It's this. I made it clear up front to separate, and that's one of those conversations you have, especially when you don't know the players, when you're all sitting there online, and you say that, this is the representation of the attitudes of the people of that time. And not all the Hungarians thought that way. I didn't make all Hungarians evil, gypsy hating savages, but several of the people in authority that they had to deal with had attitudes. So this even came directly into play in this particular game. So the origins, apparently, of a lot of what we see, as I mentioned, come from our dear friend Mr. Howard, or our not dear friend Mr. Howard. In fact, that's where I decided to take, doing a little bit of reading last night, that's where I decided to take this one from. So, do we still need race in D&D? And this is a pretty recent article. And, in world, again, I take everything I read on the internet and see on the internet from authoritative gaming sources with a really big chunk of salt. Not even a grain, just a chunk. Because they're all just like me. They're all people out there with these opinions. Some of them I agree with. There was the whole thing about 2 years ago, and we've gone round and round and round about this in some of our private circles, that the one article that talks about Tolkien's racism in creating the orcs as the militarized African race. And that I thought was totally preposterous. I thought that was mind-blowingly preposterous. I thought that article in and of itself was extremely racist and extremely uninformed, and I'm just reading this, and I had two black game design students at the time, and I was very frank. I really want to kind of talk. Let's see. They didn't know Tolkien's views, first of all, right? So, and I brought this up with these students, and they were like, that is completely ridiculous. They're like, no, H.P. Lovecraft, that guy was a racist. I'm like, oh yeah, no doubt. I'm like, I'm not going to argue with that. Like, we all know that. Even those of us who like his work know that. I said, but Tolkien distinctly described where the orcs came from. The orcs were not an ethnic race from another continent. They were a created magical monster. They were the symbol of, they were elves with PTSD. They were symbols of what happens with mechanization and with the homogenization of culture. If anything, if you read the orcs in the book, their lingo are Cockney accented dock workers and mill workers. They're being treated as like this kind of like slave labor working class. And even there's that one whole famous dialogue at the end of Lord of the Rings where they talk about maybe we can overthrow the big boss and we're going to become bosses ourselves, right? That was like a commentation on factory life in England at the time. This had so, it was, yes, this had so, here we go. Hey, Wendell, good to see you. I haven't seen you in a little while. I've been erratic in my streaming anyway. I haven't been on during the day because I need to get a book done. So now that it's almost done, maybe I'll pop on again a little more during the day too. And they were punishment for the elves, right? It was more, if you want to equate it to anything, it was more of a fall from grace scenario, and it was less about any kind of ethnicity. And to make this accusation against Tolkien, and again, there were people even in the one large group I attended who had decided they were to become the vocal advocates of this theory. And cool. All right. I'll talk to you about it online. I'll shoot you a note later. We'll talk about the job. Hopefully it's a good job. Hopefully you're enjoying it. So the dwarves are touchy. So accusing Tolkien of, he was very vocal very vocal against the Nazis, very vocal in support of Jews during World War II and freeing Europe. There is an interview that I have seen with my own eyes where he does directly compare dwarves to these Semitic people, and that was cringy. I was just like, oh my God, there go all the arguments right out the window. I would definitely say that was, what would be the word? Insensitive. Again, I don't think in Tolkien's world, yes. They were both very, very Christian. So that also does play into some of the themes, of course, of C.S. Lewis's work. And even Lord of the Rings, by the end of it, had become very laden with a lot of Christian imagery and overtones, whereas originally, I felt he was retelling mythologies. I think that was the case. I don't necessarily feel that he was going off on any kind of supportive rant one way or the other for any kind of eugenics agenda. Unlike Lovecraft, that makes these statements even in personal letters that just scream eugenics all over the place, and you just kind of like read them and you're like, oh man, boy, hate to say this, but I'm glad he's dead and he's not on Twitter, right? Because we'd have to J.K. Rowling him. We'd have to just be like, nope, sorry, not playing Call of the Cthulhu, Oh, and even Sandy Peterson. Sandy Peterson came out with some really 70-year-old white privilege comments at one point, who wrote Call of Cthulhu and programmed Doom and did all these other things that were so instrumental in my early gaming. I was like, Sandy, just shut up. Like, all right, if you have these opinions, I'm not going to change them, but just shut up. Come on. So the interesting thing that he points out in this article, which is what I have contested all along, when people have pointed to Tolkien as the source of this idea of races in fantasy games, is that in Tolkien's world, these beings literally were different races. The elves, the dwarves, the humans were quite literally different species. They were not variants of humans. Now, people have said to me, okay, what about half elves? Okay, that I'm not going to touch because I don't even know what the intersection there was, except for this idea of divinity being able to fuse with humanity and create something unique. That's how I always interpreted this idea of half elves. Well, Elrond half elven. He was in Tolkien's work. Elrond's actually quarter elf, right? Or is Elrond's half elven, Arwen's quarter elven. That was in the original Lord of the Rings. He was referred to at one point as Elrond the half elven. Now, unlike the movies, there is not quite as much emphasis on some of that as comes about. Yeah, I don't know. So upset after. Scroll this down. After I called the quadroon, I never brought it up again. Right, exactly, right. And so that's where the concept of okay. I was telling me I can't allow that message, PJ's last message, because it's they think he's being racist, but it's not, because I know PJ and I know that's not his intent in the joke. And it's about Elrond. It's not a real person. Elves aren't real. So I've always argued that Tolkien's source and yes, obviously the original Dungeons and Dragons was greatly influenced by Tolkien because there were halfling hobbits, elves, dwarves, etc. But I think where D&D got it wrong, and I'll say that bluntly, is they made them basically humans with long beards, humans with pointy ears. And I think that has actually, I thought that was funny. It was like moderating it. Nightbot was doing its job. Instead of kicking Justin off the feed for something he said at one point, for using too many emojis, which was really funny, I was like, "Hey, kick Justin off." I have always had this issue of saying, oh, well, D&D, I mean, it's okay because there are all these different races, and we'll call them races because of, the space in Lord of the Rings. I mean, really, it's not. And actually, original D&D was much closer to things like Fritz Lieber and Howard than I think it would be Tolkien, except for the inclusion of the Tolkienian vision of dwarves, elves, and halflings and whatnot. And of course, we know the source material. Yep. So the AD&D translation of race, I think, is where things started to go wrong. Because not only were they then starting to become portrayed, particularly by the time we got to Forgotten Realms, as people with pointy ears or people with beards with cool abilities, they quite literally limited their capacity in true racist format, right? In true racist fashion. Well, humans are the best at everything, but orcs can never be that smart. Half-orcs can never be that smart. Elves can never be that whatever elves were limited in, cleric or something, whatever. They couldn't even be high-level magic users, and that to me was always the joke. Like elves should be if you're going by Tolkien, elves should be the best magic users in the game, right? They should get double the level of magic use of everybody else. Which by the time the Elf Handbook in D&D came out, it was second D&D was close to it. Dwarves should be the toughest guys there. Dwarves should get double the hit points right off the bat if we're going to limit anything or educate anything by race. And I guess the question where all this starts to come together is, and this article addresses this, and it's a nice address, because again, it's something I've been saying for quite a very long time. What role, if any, does this idea of race, particularly the way it's generally been treated in RPGs, have? Does it have a role? So let's touch on the Dark Elves, the Drow Elves, for a moment, because this is really loaded. So one of my first Renaissance fairs, New York Renaissance Fair, decades ago, I walked into a booth and there were a bunch of people who, at first, what I thought were in blackface. And I was just like, yow. Then I realized they were supposed to be Drow. And I was like, okay, supposed to be Drow. They were still a bunch of extremely white people from Connecticut with black makeup on all over the place. And in fact, there was a joke about that in the show Community. Now, I'm not a big Community fan, but when they also down to play D&D, the Asian guy shows up basically in blackface to play a dark elf. And you know, there's a really, Chevy Chase's character makes this really rude joke about it. And in fact, that episode is no longer shown. And we all know that like the low-hanging fruit of this and all this stereotyping was extremely common in the old days of RPGs, when it was mostly people, let's say of my demographic, who were sitting around in large groups and they didn't deal with other people who weren't like them. And and we've talked about this, the number of ethnic minorities and the strata of gender was very narrow at these old events and in the old culture. So, you know, people have said to me, okay, but the Drow Elves, and I've even argued this to some degree myself. Sometimes you need the cardboard cutout villain, right? Drow Elves, especially in the original versions and in Warhammer, are so now in Warhammer they're not dark skinned, which is very interesting because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was a contemporary of second ed advanced of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So in the British extrapolation of the hobby, they did not blackface dark elves, which I think is very, very interesting. Where does this come from? The myth of the dark elf comes from Norse mythology, the Svartalfar. They weren't dark-skinned. Right. Besides, if you live underground your whole life, you're not going to be dark-skinned. That's a whole other discussion. That's just kind of, that ties into other things. I mean, at least Robert E. Howard's Stygians came from an environment where people could have been darker complected. But we know that they were based on Egyptians. And Egyptians natively were not as dark-skinned as Central African people. So again, we have Howard taking this concept of the evil Eastern sorcerers and making them very dark-skinned, which, again, this is typical of the time. The Dark Elves in Norse mythology were only called the Svartalfar because they dealt in the underworld with the gods who were not the Aesir, because they followed Loki and betrayed the Lossifar, the Light Elves. The idea of them being complected like that is purely Dungeons and Dragons for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So I have made some jokes about the Oriental Adventures book recently, like, you know, sending it to my texts and like, hey guys, we're going to play this next week, you know? And okay, when I was 12 years old when that came out, or 13 years old and came out, that I was like, oh man, you could play like ninja and all these cool things. And now, of course, even looking through it, you just kind of have this cringe of like, wow. I mean, at least kung fu movies were ironic. Like, this isn't even really ironic. Much in the same way the Dark Elves weren't ironic, the Drow Elves weren't ironic. So, when it comes to race, though, forget this actual notion of throwing a stereotype, an ethnic stereotype on a fantasy race. I mean, because that, to me, doesn't have any place at this point. It really doesn't. For two reasons. The second of which, the main one I'm going to get to in a moment. I mean, first of all, it's literally racist, right? Okay, we'll get that right out of the way, right? Exactly. Exactly. Well, and it tells you though, as Wolfie said, the access point at that point was not scholarly. It was Asian action movies, and it was Seven Samurai, and it was things like this where they took what they saw and they just implanted it and stereotyped it. Does the cutout cardboard orc or dark elf, okay, drop the ethnic appearance. Let's say you even make them light skinned. Does that, the master came out, that's true. Does that monoculture evil race have a place in these games at this point? That's a rhetorical question. I'm not proposing an answer. Because there are certain creatures in my D&D games, like gnolls, that I make unapologetically rapacious, evil, animal-like, because they are part hyena. So again, this is also, they follow a demon lord. I mean, I do not feel bad about making the gnolls, who are the furry, woolly hyena men. I don't have any problem making them unapologetically evil. Now, mind you, when I run these games, I'm also a little purist. Like I do cringe a little bit at a lot of the new form D&D and some of the new form Firefly's Reavers. Right, that's exactly a good yeah. Where I don't necessarily think I need to humanize gnolls. Right? Like if somebody said I really want to play a gnoll in one of my games, it would be this really hard sell. Now that's personally my personal preference in fantasy. I prefer, as clearly writing a human-based game, I prefer a game where all the core characters are a little closer to some reality. I mean, even like bringing in things like the tieflings and the dragonborn as player characters to me is like a big leap from my kind of purist old school fantasy roots. But I will allow them. I mean, they are statistically in the core book. That's the sort of thing I can step back and say, okay, cool, something else cool and weird to play. The new Pathfinder book where you're allowed to play like a skeleton or something. I mean, I kind of just don't get it. If I ran a game where you were all playing undead and it was going to be like the Undercity in World of Warcraft, the City of the Dead, I'd be like, okay, that'd be kind of cool. That'd be weird, to run a game that specifically is built like that. But I do think there's a certain place. Well, so that's what we're going to get to. We're going to get to cultural specificity and culture versus race in a few minutes. And it would be really hard. So like Tom played a Kenku for just a guest appearance in my D&D game. And it was kind of fun having this Kenku show up and the party save him from the gnolls, the evil gnolls. And, he befriends the party and helps them thwart the gnolls. And we knew it was a very limited thing. We knew it was going to be like 4 sessions, right? I mean, I probably would not allow Kenku as a regular player character. I see it as being so problematic. I see it being as so weird. And I understand that modern D&D and Pathfinder in particular have become more like the Star Wars universe, where you walk into a bar in a city and you see all these weird and exotic creatures roaming around. But my big problem is, and this comes up to the second part, my big problem is that there's no cultural identity with them beyond these kind of weird tricks and stereotypes, these gimmicks. I see the presentation of most fantasy races is very gimmicky, and I don't see the cultural depth. Now, why in so many fantasy settings that have come out recently, refreshingly, why do they have a dozen different human cultures from different parts of the world that maybe, yes, they're just analogous to our Asia. They're analogous to our Africa. They're analogous to our Central America. Fine. But then why aren't there a breadth of demi-human races that also have these cultures? Why isn't there this investment to make these non-human races as or ancestries? And even to be calling them ancestry is problematic because that means they're effectively all the same species but with different ancestries. Now, if your world is built in that, I actually think that would be an interesting way to handle it. That the Kenku are related to the humans, there's some different ancestry involved. And I think when you get into this meta view of like, okay, there's dragonborn that have dragon ancestry, orcs that have giant ancestry, or half giants with giant ancestry, however you want to position it. I think that's a really interesting way of handling it. Well, species, I think is a very good way of handling it. Because then you can absolutely say, dwarves are not humans, they're dwarves. Right? Kenku are not humans, they're not an ancestry. They're a species. They're a different species of creature. But species does not have the same loaded implication of race, which is inherently a loaded implication. The word race is an inherently loaded implication. But then why don't we have entire cultural aspects to bugbears, right? I mean, why don't we? And again, this is all rhetorical. And this is one of the reasons why I decided Tales of the Harrowed Land was going to be human-centric. Because I thought there were so many interesting things to do with human culture in these games. And explore... Well, so we could really deeply get into that, right? That at heart, right, people, even writers, are lazy. And this idea of researching this entire cultural history for the weird little birdmen, is really big. Now, again, don't forget, most of these non-human races, hey, me, what's up? Most of these non-human races started out as non-player characters. And they were something you encountered as a human, or at the weirdest, a halfling, or a gnome, right? And therefore they were the other. They started out distinctly as the other. They started out as this being that is so radically different than a human, we can't really... Like at one point somebody said, does an ogre look at it early on in gaming, does an ogre look at a person like we look at lobsters? Well, but ogres are humanoid. They're biologically very similar to humans, but according to the descriptions in the book, they're a different species. Well, right. So Ed Greenwood, and again, I think his work was great, and I think his work was groundbreaking, and he did take the Drow and make, through the eyes of one character who was an outcast to his society, who are all still... Oh, so let's not even get into this idea of the Drow also being matriarchal demon worshippers, because is this whole other loaded content about the point of view of early game writers, right? Not only are they dark-skinned demon worshippers, they're dark-skinned woman demon worshippers, right? So this is this whole other mess that you just get into, and you just sit there and you decipher this 40 years later and you go, wow, there's a reason why the hobby had the reputation it did for so long. And it wasn't because people were devil worshippers. The reputation I'm thinking of is the neckbeard. You got your misogyny and my racism, right? And the Drow are just like a racism misogyny sandwich. You're going on right there, like peanut butter and jelly. They're mashed right together. So you're just sitting there and going, wow. But again, so you have these cardboard cutout villains, but somebody sat there and said, I'm going to invert this entire narrative, right? I'm going to invert this entire narrative about these beings and make someone who's an outcast and doesn't go along with what they believe in or what they do. And I think that was the really interesting thing about that. And that opened up the door for the vast bulk of these types of beings becoming player characters. I remember when the Player Monsters book came out for Second Ed, and there were already things from Dragon Magazine out there. And Blake ran a game where we all played the monsters. You know, it was hilarious because we did play them like the stereotypes. I think one guy played an ogre, one guy played an orc. You know, it was, and of course it was just rampaging the countryside and eating people and robbing caravans and all those things that you're not supposed to do as player characters. You go and do as a monster. You know, that was about 2 years before White Wolf. So you know that kind of opened up the floodgates then to this entire concept of playing the villain, humanizing the villain. You're blowing my man, says Rory. Yeah, this is the ancient history of the game. This is how things were. But yeah, then there was this. So 3 and 3.5 still maintained a lot of these old notions of race in these games. They did a little bit more with culture, though. I remember reading the Halflings in 3.0 and going, cool. So they actually decided to make them not just hobbits anymore. Like they actually gave them some. Now, okay, identity was the Romany, basically. They were kind of gypsy-like. So again, that was kind of like, ooh, you know, even in 2000 when I was reading it, or a few years before that when it came out, I was reading it. I was kind of like, yeah, I don't know. But at the same time, at least there was this attempt. Right. Well, and that's the other big conundrum, right? Every person that steps into one of these characters, they immediately just become another person in a different suit. World Book Gypsies. World Book Vampires, World Book Gypsies, where the gypsies came from Egypt, and that's where they got their name. Right? This was in World Book Gypsy, and you just read this and you went, "Oh my god." And again, that was not in the Dark Ages. You know, that was in the mid 90s that came out. And even at that point, with, you know, some interest in history and a fundamental knowledge and understanding of migrations, I knew the gypsies hadn't come from Egypt. You know, I knew if anything, they were an Indo-European people who migrated and continued migrating long after most other Indo-European people had stopped. You know, I was aware of this, and I thought anybody who would write a book on, you know, for the World of Darkness, who would be writing a book about the gypsies would not take the Bram Stoker approach that they're all evil vampire worshipping thieves. You know, you would think that they would have done that. No, they didn't do that. I remember at the time that book was super cringy. You know. But yeah, so that's the other big issue, right? Like, so 99% of the people then who say, oh, I want to play a bugbear, just again we're going to take a bugbear and we're just going to make him a big dumb human, or use a human cultural trope and stick it on to the bugbear, yeah. Bloodbear, that's a new one. New monster. Stick it on to the bugbear. Without much thought as to, okay, so why is this bugbear bard now suddenly a dapper English accented bugbear? Right? It just doesn't make sense. And okay, let's step back. And I understand that, especially like D&D, the experience to sit around and have fun with your friends. And most people are not interested in linguistics, history, migration timelines when they sit down to play a D&D character. And you know what? Neither am I. Like, if I sit down to just play D&D, I'm interested in playing the dwarf. Right? Come for the gameplay, stay for the crude humor. That's really what it's about. You know, that's most role-playing sessions. But I've always felt it was a real kind of disservice to the hobby. Now, mind you, I'm not saying I have any great desire to do this because I know from my own ideas. But why hasn't anybody written the comprehensive history of the orcish people? Right now, there are a couple games that do start to do this and are actually get a little more in depth with like the demi-human cultures and the variations in these cultures within these cultures, and I do really appreciate that. And I kind of hate to admit it, but some of the best orcs I've seen, Orc World, Orc World, the one of the better representations of orcs that I saw is, but the man is divisive, shall we say. I actually didn't read Orc World, so I don't know. Is the Blizzard Entertainment version of orcs and goblins. I mean, okay, the goblins are really goofy, especially the World of Warcraft goblins. But originally, some of their stuff from the early Warcraft and some of the lore they had put in there was quite well done. So yeah, Mystaria had some interesting stuff. And yeah, some of the original World of Warcraft stuff, I thought I actually really did a pretty good job of fleshing out these cultures and giving them a little bit of a unique quality among this vast swath. Now, again, we're not going to talk about Warhammer Fantasy because Warhammer Fantasy is the parody of all this. Warhammer Fantasy is taking all of this to this reduced British Cold War humor, that again, I remember recently one of the LARPers on my feed, who is a younger woman, reading some of the Warhammer lore and just putting up, oh my god, it's like, it looks like it was written from like this completely moronic Grognard point of view. And I was like, but that's the whole point. I'm like, that was the whole point of Warhammer. That Warhammer was a satire on D&D, a satire on fantasy literature, a satire on Cold War Europe, a satire on medieval Europe, a satire on America. Warhammer was intentionally meant to be that way, which is honestly why it's still one of my favorite worlds out there, because it is just this giant joke. And yes, there are a lot of Warhammer players that take themselves, both 40k and fantasy, that take themselves way, way too seriously, and they don't get the joke. That to me is kind of like Nazis listening to Death in June, though unfortunately Doug Pierce has kind of become a Nazi. But, originally Death in June was kind of this entire parody of that whole Norse supremacy, Norse mysticism. It was kind of, in the British lingo, taking the piss on all that. Unfortunately, Doug Pierce started taking himself too seriously, which is really strange to me. That you're kind of like, wow, this guy really became a believer in his own bullshit after a while. And that's kind of scary given his own personal background. I'm like, yeah, boy, Nazis would have loved you. You're just about everything they didn't like. So that's kind of bizarre to me, but so that's where we're at. So the deepest dive, I think, the deepest take I want to come away with from tonight is that I feel this idea of race. I feel the idea of race in gaming personally, and the use of the term race is in fact outmoded. I think, culture evolves. I understand there are still a lot of people who don't understand how loaded the term race is. But I think gaming culture, especially with the new diversity coming into it, can do a lot better. I think species, if you have to differentiate these things as not human, if they're that different, let's use species. But if they're not that different, then why don't we have... So to me, this is very much like Star Trek. Like, okay, I know Star Trek solves this problem by saying there was some vast godlike intelligence, alien intelligence, that seeded the universe with common genetics. And that's why Romulans, humans, Vulcans, the whole Ferengi, Klingons have this unified biology. They have a common biology to one degree or another. They have quite a few common cultural traits that overlap. And that was a very good way that throughout Next Generation they threw off that early, very, 40s fantasy view, 50s fantasy view of what races were. That they were basically just variations of the human, except, the real humans are the best all around. I mean, sure, the Klingons might be smarter, and the Klingons might be stronger, Vulcans might be smarter, but humans are really still the best. And D&D adopted a lot of that. Like, I remember very distinctly reading all the early versions of D&D where they said, well, humans' versatility and adaptability is what makes them effective. They didn't say superior, but effectively superior. And I always thought that was a really, even as a kid, I thought that's a really strange way of putting it. Again, why can't a dwarf be as tough or doubly tough as a human? So it was always a weird thing. Call back to Dragon Quest in case Tom's listening tonight. One of the cool things that I thought about Dragon Quest, even though Dragon Quest had all its own problems, was that that was even more sword and sorcery than D&D was, but the non-human stuff in there was like really non-human. Like, you could play a werewolf that wasn't a human. It was a werewolf. I was like, all right, that's pretty cool. I never really tried playing the game extensively, but I always thought it would have been kind of interesting to make a run of a game like that early on. And I know some of these other games early on made stabs at this. I know, what is it? I think it's the RuneQuest elves are basically they're basically plant life, right? Is it RuneQuest? That they're basically plant life? I'm trying to remember in one of the games. They're literally a different species. They are not humanistic in any way, shape, or form. And I remember the trolls used to like to make salads out of them, which I found very, very humorous. Now there's this whole other tirade that we can get into as far as monstrous races, because that lets this whole other, set of issues in terms of what we consider human, what we consider invalid, as far as, do trolls have feelings? Could have that whole conversation. So I don't know. We talked a little bit about it last time. Before we wrap up, anybody have ideas or any experience with people who have made entirely different and entirely new cultural dynamics for their fantasy races? Got quite a few viewers. Welcome all your viewers. I've been the talking head now for about an hour. So if you want to chime, please say hello or don't, whichever. And interested in hearing if anyone's got any other thoughts. I mean, I did a little bit of this early on. I remember doing a breakdown of hobgoblins for a game back in like the 90s. Different groups of hobgoblins with different cultural dynamics. Who knows? Who knew that 10 years later I could have published it as OGL material, right? If only I had all those old notes. Those old homebrew notes. I can now publish it all OGL. While it's still here. Before they change their minds again. And so I don't know if Wolfie or PJ said it earlier, but yeah, people are basically lazy, right? Like, okay, elves and elf. All right, yeah, there are high elves. Now, elves in D&D, there are high elves, wood elves. There are some different cultural ranges there. The dwarves in D&D, there were some different cultural ranges after a while. They did flesh these out. I remember a lot of them came out of Dragon Magazine. Like, okay, why don't we have this particular variation of elf, just like we have this variation of human? So, do I have it right here? Probably one of the single best books to come out in a long time. Pathfinder, Lost Omens, Melungi Expanse, which was written under the advisement and with the direction of non-European and some African American authors and scholars. And it does actually cover what happens if elves and dwarves, etc., live in this environment, that live in the Melungi Expanse. How do you rationalize this person, this non-human species, effectively, or ancestry in this case, as not being white, right? And they have a lot of really cool language stuff in there. And for those of you who follow along with Tales, I do have some basic language markups and write-ups for the different for the different cultures. So PJ developed some several culture. Yeah, yeah, it makes. Well, and I think anybody, and again, I understand that the number of people who, one, have the time or the desire or the drive to sit down and write, oh, so how many different, ethnic breakdowns of Goblin are there within my game? I mean, in most cases, that doesn't actually impact the game. So I'm not even talking about us as a game master running a game. I'm thinking in terms of game designers, and I'm hoping we see more of it, because as we know, the hobby is getting extremely diverse. It's becoming worldwide. It's becoming embraced by different cultures. It's being embraced by a lot of people who are not of European descent, finally. So I'm hoping we're going to see more of this. I'm hoping we're going to see more of this kind of care and thought put into this idea of culture. And right, and culture is national, right? And so background, that's a whole other night. background, notes, mental notes, background, and misogyny in early role-playing games, or in contemporary role-playing games. First time chatter, podcast and Dill, it's Don Buddy. Okay, how's it going? Hit me up later. Well, so right, we've had this discussion about music and about metal and about especially metal quite a bit. Like, why aren't I'm enjoying seeing the dearth of Native American and South American metal bands putting out stuff in native language. Native culture. I think that's pretty cool. And I'm hoping to see more of that in games. And I'm hoping to just drop this notion of race becoming this thing that determines so much about a character or a setting. Let's see. Yep. Yeah, Melkesh is pretty cool. Is this Don J? I see Don J. I'm just trying to figure out who that is. Because it sounds like it, it's in Delaware. Anyway, hit me up after, because I think I know who it is. I'm not gonna use those. Yeah, okay. So hey Don, what's up? Good to see you. Okay. I thought I'm trying to decipher it. I'm like DEL Delaware. Oh, okay. All right, cool. All right. Well, let's talk. Check out your stuff. I didn't know you were doing a podcast. I will check out a podcast. All right, yeah. Definitely good to see you. Speaking of metal, see if maybe we'll make it down for a day for the metal day down in Delaware, down at Birmingham. We're gonna see about it. I'd like to. I don't know. We're gonna be traveling the week before, so I don't know. But yeah, definitely. Let's hook up. Let's hook up and chat. Glad you popped on. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I listen to a lot of metal when I'm creating, especially the Tales of the Howard Land stuff. I listen to a lot of metal when I'm working on it. In fact, I mean, the entire kind of branding of it, at least initially, especially the design, the logo design, and all that, was meant to emulate like kind of 80s heavy metal stuff, And I did in fact try to pull in a lot of the aesthetics. Like if you read through the gifts, there's actually a lot of metal song titles and references in the gifts. Some of the gifts the characters can use. So it's kind of like an Easter egg for people who might listen to Exodus, and they might find a trait called Strike of the Beast or something like that. And I know PJ will like that. So yeah, it's definitely an influence. And in fact, I'm probably going to put a playlist But it more than that, the game's become a lot bigger than that because I've also started tying in a lot of this goes to my own development. A lot of my cultural development in the world has been these deep dives into non-Western ancient culture, particularly Fertile Crescent era and Greco-Roman, pre-Greco-Roman. So that definitely is all tied in. But I mean, it kind of goes back to what PJ and I were saying that we'd like to see more music embracing or more metal music embracing those roots too. So that genre also expands. And it has a lot over the last few years. Oh yeah, well I think that's almost where's Bang My Stupid Long Hair? I mean, I think that kind of is implicit in some regards. I think especially all of us who were into this early on kind of came from the same place with that. That's pretty interesting. I never really thought about that. Um, that's another weird thing I found myself researching. I found myself researching a lot of biophysics in some of these gifts, even though these gifts are in fact superhuman traits or whatever you want to call them. That I did look into like, okay, well, how in the real world would say a wrestler or a basketball player be able to do something like this? And not that I'm trying to make it realistic, but I wanted to at least see if there was some foundation there that I could put it in terms of like, all right, could a human actually do this if they had a high enough statistic? I know a few other games have done that. I mean, I think D&D is so kind of divorced in terms of design from human norm that I think there's this assumption that people are going to be superhuman and other species. I almost said race. Other races. After my whole diatribe about the word race. The other species and other ancestries will be superhuman. I think we're going to start wrapping it up for tonight. Thanks a lot for everybody for timing in. Good to see you, Don. And Paige and Maeve and everybody else who's been chatting. Russ. That's a really good question. I don't know enough. I was just looking generally in terms of athletics and human capability. I don't know enough about specific athletes. That'd be kind of interesting, right? And what's funny is I know there are several athletes who actually play role-playing games. So I bet it would be funny if you could find one of these people and say, "Hey, would you mind becoming, the statistical makeup of a character in my game?" And they'd probably be all over it. Of course, probably have to pay them, but that's a really interesting thought. Never thought about that. Now my brain's working in that direction. All right. Pop up that stuff. All right, friends. Thanks for tuning in. From the Tomes, Twitch TV from the Tomes, Fox and Board Games at Patreon, Fox and Board Games. See you later, Wolfie. FoxandBoardGames.com is the landing pad for everything, and you can also find some cool stuff to download there. At FoxandBoardGames.com on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks everyone for coming on. Check out our new guide. Yes, I mentioned the new guide early on. I don't know at what point you came on, Maeve, but I did mention it early on. There's a new guide to story development, about a 5-page guide that I whipped up and that we put up, that Maeve put up as online as a free download. If you give us your email, which we will have, and that'll periodically be changing. We'll have some different stuff that's being offered there soon. So also a big shout out to Maeve, who's been doing all the social media, and a lot of the cool stuff you've been seeing on social media is her creation. So thanks again for that. And until next time, plan for another chat in 2 weeks. In the meantime, stop by the social media, stop by the webpage. I look forward to seeing everybody then.